Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Relating to DevSecOps. It's been a while since we've been in the saddle. I'm in a polo shirt today, but you know what? We are recording episode number 70, that is 70 today for you all, and I'm very excited to be back. We've had a lot of work going into the middle of the year, closing out Q1 and Q2, so we are a whole month behind, Mike. And I'm sure everyone is really disappointed that we're still going, but we're back and we're going to talk about source code. We're going to talk about SCA. We're going to talk about supply chain, maybe get into some SBOM today. How are you feeling about these exciting DevSecOps topics?
I've been waiting for months to discuss this, so very excited.
Months.
Yes.
About as long as it takes us to update a library.
Exactly. Good
Yeah,
segue.
exactly. So we'll jump right into it. We got some great feedback from folks. So we're gonna take some more time to sort of dive into the topic and introduce them a little bit better as we open up this can of worms. So we're talking about supply chain security today, and that involves a lot of acronyms like SBOM, SCA, and supply chain. And so I think it'd be worth it to just go through each of these and talk a little bit about what they mean and how they affect software security today, especially in the world of DevSecOps. So, Mike, how would you define the supply chain? And if you feel like it, software composition analysis.
Um, sure. I'll give you my take, and then you give me your take. We'll see where we
Sure,
end up.
sure.
Uh, I think supply chain and software. I I think of it as two things. There's supply chain and software, which is all the different components you use when you write software. Libraries. We've been talking about libraries in the application security world for over a decade now. Um, I worked through the Ruby Gems hack back when that happened, and that was a whole huge issue. And that was a big supply chain issue, and we've had hack after hack in terms of the library repos, and also just name squatting, library takeovers, GitHub takeovers, a million different things. So there's that whole part of the supply chain and the application security and application framework um, piece to the supply chain, and that gets a lot of attention. I think we were just talking before we started about we went to a conference together, and there was like five different SCA, SBOM, static analysis companies out there. So it's a huge focus, and that's definitely one part of the supply chain. I think the other part that is maybe a little less mature is we buy tons of COTS software, commercial off-the-shelf software. Everything from VPNs to file transfer systems to whatever software you're not building internally and you integrate into your whole tech ecosystem. That's also the supply chain, and those all have supply chains. And so I think the application supply chain piece and how SCA plugs into it has gotten a lot of focus. And then now we're sort of talking about all the other stuff in the supply chain of like things that you don't build yourself. Maybe you don't host it yourself, but it's part of your whole tech ecosystem, and you have to have a concern about how it's built, how it's secured, vulnerabilities, all that kind of stuff. So that's my take on the two pieces of supply chain.
And I don't disagree with any of that.
That's no fun.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I think we're just defining things. There's no debate yet.
Ah,
Well, hopefully, um, although there is very often debate around what terms mean. Hence the name
mhm.
of the show, relating to DevSecOps. But yeah, I agree. It's basically everything that makes up your software, um, from source to sync. And as we grow in these modern workloads, I think that it becomes more and more apparent that we are not really developing the majority of our own code. And there's a lot of things that we rely on in order to get code from, an idea to deployment. And now, even with new ways of automating this through generative AI and LLMs and all the ways that folks are developing software, we're less and less in control of what we are implementing. So every library that you include inside of your code, every time somebody imports a library or imports a component, that is part of your software and something that you need to consider in terms of your supply chain. What are the building blocks or the ingredients of your software, as SZA would say, for your software bill of materials, or SBOM. So your SBOM is really a list of all of these open source and third-party components that are present in your code. And with some of the federal guidance on software bill of materials between SZA and some of the other federal authorities, they're saying that it's important to know what are all of these components of your software. And I don't think we disagree on that. I think that everyone agrees that it would be good to know what goes into your software. And this is just putting some acronyms and entire markets around making this a reality. So hopefully that breaks it down for folks listening. And so now I think we want to talk a little bit about like the risks of using other people's software in your own software, and potentially how to consider that as you're developing or as you're deploying production workloads. So, Michael, with all of these definitions swimming around, why don't people just create their own software, like build it from scratch? Like it's the supply chain. So, all right, why don't we just use less other software? Why do you think that people are more and more reliant on these third-party libraries?
Because I don't think you could possibly ever recreate LeftPad. It was too complex. What's that meme? We can't build this anymore. We've lost the way. For anyone who doesn't know what LeftPad is, it was an NPM library that just added left padding to text that was included in like thousands of different NPM packages, and then it got yanked one day and broke the internet, basically. I think people use the frameworks and the libraries that they know, and they just kind of keep recreating them. And I think there's definitely building components and using components to build software is definitely a good model to do. It's just I think we've gotten to the point where we in software use so many different components that other people build, even for the simplest things, that it's just become sort of a hodgepodge of different libraries for small pieces of your app versus using like one framework that gives you everything. I think there's differences in different languages. Like I think in the JavaScript world, you end up with like, maybe not hundreds, but close to 100 libraries for all the different components you might need. I think in the .NET and Java world, you still use packages, but you might use a handful. So I think there are different ecosystems that have different norms about them. But I think in some worlds, the JavaScript, the Ruby, the Python, you end up using a lot of different packages just to kind of give you helper functions in this area or that area that maybe the standard library doesn't include. So it's easier just to import something, have that function ready to go versus writing it yourself and then building a, whatever it is, a class, a model to do all that work for you.
So are you saying that it's more the open source, like how flexible the communities are, versus when you're talking about .NET or Java, that the ecosystems are like these helper functions and things that folks build are just built into the frameworks themselves from the beginning?
I think, from what I've seen more of that. Like Java and the .NET world, they'll rely a lot more on kind of core libraries, and then you'll see a lot less random, unsupported, like one-off libraries. Versus JavaScript and Ruby and Python, you'll see smaller, less supported libraries being included. You see a lot of Apache libraries in Java, obviously, and those are much more well supported, and you just don't see the same in kind of the Ruby or JavaScript world. It could be some random package that some guy just wrote that he needed and put up there, and it became super popular. And that got included somewhere else, and that got they all become referential and become more and more popular, and it could literally be one person. I mean, the thing we haven't said yet that happened since our last episode is the whole XZ thing, talking about supply chain. That was the ultimate supply chain failure. But again, it's like people started trusting a library maintained by one burnt out person, and it almost became a disaster.
Well, let's talk about that disaster um, in a moment when we get into disasters and failures of supply chain. But I think one thing I just want to add there is I find it pretty interesting your perspective there, because it really is about like what is the ecosystem of folks. I mean, you talk like we're all poking fun at each other around what languages we prefer or whatever, and um, I do think that part of it is built out of convenience. We all want these things because we want to limit the amount of time it takes to get from an idea to execution. And so the fastest path to that is really what attracts the market. So whether that is, a library that's already pre-built that exposes functions that are easier for you to work with, whether that's like an API library, which is probably the most popular, or something like that. Or if it is generative AI and you're like, man, I just want this thing to like go and do this thing. Oh, I just want to write a rule for SemGraph, or I just want to have this method. This thing will write it for me. That's why it's so popular, because it just
Yeah.
reduces the amount of time to get to that from the idea phase to the execution phase, which it has its benefits and its obviously its hurdles. And then I think the other thing that you mentioned, which made me think about it a little bit more, is that it's not that these things aren't found in other languages. It's just the method in which we get there lends itself in open source to, yeah, maybe you had the idea in the best way and you didn't anticipate being like the supporter of this massive project, and now you are, as opposed to Apache or someone or Oracle or whatever that is supporting all of these packages as a business model. There's benefits and detriments to that too. So it is this open source versus libraries versus um, enterprise support types of libraries that does sort of make a difference. I think we need to consider both. Certainly, if we talk about supply chain, mentioning another major failure, which we'll get into, is the whole SolarWinds thing. I mean, that's an enterprise company, and you're sort of trusting that. So they have, and when you think about using those products, it's supply chains of your supply chain, and how it ends up in your hands as well. So really wrangling it all seems really, really difficult. So before we get into how we can get our hands around that, let's dive into failures and problems, because I think that's the most fun. I mean, we all love to complain a little bit. So tell us about the XZ thing.
Yeah. I mean, basically, XZ was a compression library. Correct me if I'm wrong on all this because it's been about a month since it happened. So, but it was included in a lot of low-level Linux packages as a dependency, and it was maintained by one person basically, unpaid, of course, and some threat actor. I don't think they know exactly who it is. Obviously, they suspect China, Russia, and the usual suspects. But someone started kind of helping to maintain the package, having some influence. They even had other people say like, "Yeah, have this guy help out," to get more influence with maintaining the package. And this threat actor basically started building a backdoor into the package that would it gets included in SSH, the SSH binary. So basically, they were getting a backdoor in SSH, and they discovered that it would allow them to have access into any SSH agent that had this um, had this included in it. So it got detected because a Microsoft engineer noticed SSH logins taking a little too long. Basically, dug into it and saw this inclusion in the file during the build and figured out that this was basically a backdoor. And thankfully didn't get pushed out that widely, but it could have been huge if it wasn't noticed. And it was, incredibly subtle. Think about a build script that includes something in a package that's inside another package that's shipped on almost every Linux distro. Like it's super subtle, and there's not a lot of people looking at it, but it got through the build process, got released, but thankfully got caught early on and rolled back. So definitely for the most part a disaster averted, but it just shows that there's not that many guardrails on these things.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, I mean, I think that we're seeing a rise in these types of attacks. So catching it early is really important. I mean, I've had a couple of instances, especially in the open source world, where a bug bounty is submitted, and you're like, man, that could have been bad, or and it's been maybe sitting there for you know 6 months, a year,
Mhm.
and it's just, oh, that person had the wherewithal to find that and report it, or maybe just had one element of knowledge that not everyone else had. So, it not all of these systems are going through all of the same type sort of evaluations that you're going through as an organization. Um, you know, Really, just as recently as the 11th, there was a supply chain attack carried out on Sisense, and I think that it had something to do with the supply chain. And I don't really have a lot of the details there, but you're seeing that, hey, people are looking for these weaknesses, and going after those exploits. I think the other interesting thing, just tying this into um, the generative AI space, not to keep coming back to that, but I recently read I can't remember if it was a report um, or a paper. I'll try to link it in the show notes if I can find it again. But it was saying something like they said that if you were able to give the generative AI or ChatGPT or one of these things enough of the CVE, that it could develop an exploit against the description. Did you send me that?
I don't know if I sent that, but I definitely saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was interesting that, like, a lot of times we look at these CVEs and we go, oh, well, like, where is that? Or, would I have enough time to go and like try to dig into an exploit there? And you just say, I'll forget it. But now you can sort of take those things and have that work done to a degree for you, at least give you some scaffolding around exploiting these things. So as CVEs are published, now attackers have more of a leg up on taking these and saying, "Oh, I remember seeing that footprint or that fingerprint inside of this one of these mass scans that I did, and I can go after that now since this exploit came out." So I think that we're going to see more and more of this as time goes on. We're already starting to see that increase. Um, so we are sort of getting into that. Any other attacks or major incidents you wanted to chat through before we get into how we actually potentially maybe solve this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing I was gonna say before we get into solutions is, again, we focused a lot on, there's been a lot of work in the product world and I think the consulting world too of finding the open source libraries that we use and trying to make sure that those are patched and up to date. I think the other piece that we don't always pay as much attention to is all the other, especially COTS products that we buy and we put into our ecosystem. Again, I think about VPN servers, source code management tools. Um, I mean, it's been a banner few months or banner year for vulnerabilities in VPN devices. There's the Avanti stuff that CISA basically said just like turn it off because there was such a bad exploit. There's been Cisco issues. The file transfer systems move it had a big one. Then I just saw a GitLab issue, and they've had a lot of pretty severe CVEs. So all these different pieces of software that we buy, and it's part of the ecosystem that you have, so that you have to maintain, that your SBOMs aren't going to find those and tell you that there's a vulnerability there. Like, it's just outside of that typical app process. So that whole piece of the quote unquote supply chain that you have to think about has to have its own process. So we buy and we use a ton of open source and non-open source software that we just don't have a huge amount of visibility into.
Yeah, and that reminds me too. One of the things that I've been noticing is that, and I don't know if I want to open this can of worms, but I'm going to do it just because. But security tooling. Have you noticed that, like, if you put security tooling through the rigor, like, a lot of folks just don't measure up.
Yeah.
Like, I'm really frustrated by it. It's like I think that there's a tendency for security tools to sort of fly under the radar. So when you start to challenge folks about it, you start getting the same responses that we always critique, which is like, oh, yeah, AWS has their SOC 2 type 2 and we're not compliant, but X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, man, but you're a security firm, like you should what I'm going to be asking. And
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just really frustrating. And I think that from a SaaS perspective and the supply chain um, perspective, you got to look at your security tools and challenge these vendors on that type of stuff because it can that I think those are the things that are going to bite folks too,
Yeah.
and we saw that again with the SolarWinds stuff and um, some of these other pieces.
Yeah. One anecdote is I'm not going to name names and they don't technically exist as a company anymore because they got bought out. But I talked to a company once that was a AppSec tool, and I said, "Well, what is your AppSec program?" And they said, "Oh, we don't really have an AppSec program. We just use our own tool against our app." And I'm like, "Okay, so yeah, that's good. I mean, way to dog food your app, but you still need more than just a tool to run in your CI/CD pipeline to address things. There's more to security than just running one tool." But anyway, I agree 100%. Security tools, for some reason, get a pass, even though they have a huge amount of access and they have very sensitive data in them, source code, secrets, whatever it might be.
Um, yeah, and access to all your other apps. I mean,
Yeah.
so something to think about. All right, cool.
Yeah.
So let's just take a little bit of a pivot. Maybe we have answers here, maybe we don't. Maybe we'll just complain some more. But let's talk a little bit more about how we can resolve some of the issues with supply chain. So, with your clients and some of the engagements you're working on, how are you seeing supply chain handled, and would you handle it differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think the good thing is I've seen progress over the past, 5 to 10 years of there's more awareness of it's not just vulnerabilities in your app you have to worry about, but you also have to manage your dependencies. So I think things like GitHub, Dependabot, all the different commercial tools, all the open source tools, they have kind of raised some awareness that you have to do more than just make sure you don't have SQL injection in your app, but you actually have to manage your dependencies. I think I think that's been really good, and I've seen more and more of that over time, and people have gotten good about integrating those things into their CI/CD so they're not introducing vulnerabilities. It's still very this is going to be a pun, but very patchy in terms of some people do it, some people just don't do it at all, or some people do it and they're like, yeah, we got a bunch of this. We're gonna get on that one day, and it sits out there for a long time. Um, we worked in IR engagement like 6 months ago where someone decided to patch their GitLab about 3 days after the threat actor got access to it. So um, patching as soon as a vulnerability is released is pretty important, but I understand it's definitely difficult for people to do a lot of the times, especially if it's a breaking change. But I have seen progress in that regard. I think the philosophical debate hasn't really shifted with most app teams to trying to reduce the amount of open source dependencies they use or vet those dependencies much more strictly than they do. I think like what you were saying, there's still a focus on moving fast, getting stuff done, and there's less of a okay, it doesn't have to be let's put this library through a 100-point checklist, but at least let's do some due diligence on it to make sure it's a quality library. So some progress, still patchy, definitely more to do, and I think that you know, there's no silver bullet. If there was, we wouldn't be doing a podcast. We'd be selling a product that was the silver bullet. And um, so it's just, due diligence, being rigorous about what you trust, and kind of staying on top of things, in my opinion.
Yeah. Um, I mean, staying on top of things is difficult, right? Um, and I think that people are challenged by how to stay on top of it. So what do you think is like? I mean, in this world where we're sort of forced to go through all of these um, updates where we have a lot of legacy software, where we're already reliant on these things. Like, how do you move the needle in an organization that maybe is very far behind?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm always about easy wins. You've talked about that in the past too, and especially aligning with the other motivations and incentives that are happening in the company. I mean, I think in some places, if you're on an old cold fusion app, like there's no easy way to just move off that. But I think the big thing is to use the incentives of the company. I mean, I think you've had some experience with this in different places in the financial world where you've had to use those incentives to make the major security change.
You mean like the stick, like the
Yes.
like the compliance
Well,
stick?
no, I don't mean just the the stick, but more of the carrot and the ways to involve the other motivations of a organization beyond just security guy chasing you around to fix stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily like the stick, but it does make things easier occasionally. I like folks to at least see some benefit in doing these things, but a lot of times you're under the wire, and I see why people use it. I mean, I like I think my focus recently has been more around like trying to get workloads into a space that considers like up to date um a kind of table stakes, like always starting up to date. Like in the most mature organizations, and I know this is not feasible for everyone, so I mean I get it, but uh, some of the some of the organizations I've worked with will have basically this infrastructure where it is constantly updated. So every time they deploy, like part of it is like updates are happening along with the deployment. And I think that that comes from starting with that mindset early. So the earlier you can get that into the mindset of your engineers and workloads to have like this atomic infrastructure, this ability to like deploy and to stay up to date and not be so reliant on the versions of libraries and to make sure that there's that hygiene along the way is the best way to do this. But even then, you're still going to be behind because you're still reliant on this supply, like the supply chain being fixed if these things are discovered. But at the very least, if something does happen as an organization, you can claim like, look, we did everything that we were at the latest version, we had all the security patches, we don't manage this software, so I know it's kind of an excuse, but it's like at least that's not, you're not 9 versions behind in addition to everything else, and you've reduced your footprint significantly. You're less likely to be attacked if you're on the edge of the version. Um, on the other side of the coin, I do have organizations that are like so far behind um, that they don't even have some like code for some of the things that they have deployed, right? It's just like, and so I mean, it's sometimes it's like, how do we like rebuild this entire thing from scratch? Because it's
Yeah.
like, we've changed so many hands, we've hired so many consultants, we've done all these things, we've outsourced our development, and now we're sort of in this position. You can't turn off the revenue faucet, right? So I think really it's twofold. It's one, as you're building new products and building new features, really resisting the urge to just move forward with the status quo and to bring in the hygiene as part of that. Like if you're moving forward and you know that you are building a new product on top of legacy software, like now it's time to fix that legacy software. Because if you don't fix it then, you're just exacerbating the problem. And that's a really tough call to make because you're like, I mean, that's probably the difference between like 3 weeks of work and 2 months of work. But that 2 months of work is going to save you major headaches in the future. And it's just really hard to showcase the value of that as a security person. So I get the challenge there. But those are the battles I think you need to fight, as opposed to someone arguing with you about, uh, whether they need USB access or not. Like, if you want to fight a fight,
Yeah.
don't fight that compliance stick fight. You want to fight the fight of making sure that that software is up to date and that you are encouraging that hygiene, because those are the
Yeah.
bigger issues. And I think that That's really important to contextualize. Is like, can I, as we are moving forward, any opportunity to update that legacy software because it is supporting new software is a really good insertion point for security.
Yeah. What is your take on SBOMs? I asked that as a semi-loaded question, but
My take on SBOM.
yeah.
Um, if I know a couple people that if like they're listening to this hot take, they're gonna disown me. But I think that it's I think that it is valuable to have an understanding of the software that makes up your software. I absolutely agree with that. I think that there are some folks that think this is the thing that you absolutely need in order to create like to have secure software. And just like a lot of these other things, I think we've placed like entirely too much focus on it. Um, because at the end of the day, I do think it isn't, it is part of your asset inventory. And I think that it's important to know, just like I think all of your assets are important, but at the same time, I think that it's like you need to contextualize that in the greater risk analysis of everything that you're dealing with if you're looking at leading a security organization. So when we put too much weight on it, just like if we put too much weight on generative AI, or we put too much weight on supply chain, or we put too much weight on SaaS, what ends up happening, in my opinion, is that the security market latches onto that. All these products come out around helping with that thing. And then now you're focused on just solving a symptom of the greater issue. So I think it's valuable. I think that you should absolutely have a software bill of materials. And I think that you should have that as part of your asset inventory. But I wouldn't get so caught up in it as like you've lost the context of why you're doing what you're doing. We know, I mean, you and I have both been through, I don't know, there's like how many SBOM supply chain vendors have like popped up in the last year and a half or 2 years? And how many people are claiming to do like reachability analysis and, oh, we can help you contextualize the risk and da, 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 da. And then you get into it and you're like, oh, well, we don't support Ruby, or we don't support Java, or we don't support JavaScript, or, oh, we can't do all your languages. And we go into the same sort of space as SAST. So it becomes this marketing term as opposed to a security function. And this is like same thing as DevSecOps. So I think that's like, it's the really important thing is it's a tool in your arsenal. Use it as a way to understand your risk posture, and then use that that map to make a decision on what to do with those. But I don't think that I think that I don't think it's feasible for all organizations to tackle these things to 100% in the time frames that are either advertised or expected by vendors and the security community. So you need to have like I think a more well-rounded picture of your risk profile, because there's a lot more than just SBOM affecting all of us. What about you?
I think that was a very well said and very nuanced response.
Well, I'm a security professional. It's got to be
I,
nuanced.
yes, I agree with you 100%. I mean, I think I'd say it more plainly as like, instead of SBOMs becoming a means to an end of finding and patching stuff, it's become like SBOMs is the thing to do, and somehow it solves all of our problems. I mean, it's like you said, DevSecOps or shift left or whatever the term of the day, like vendors are going to pick up on it. They're going to sell you on it. They're going to say it's the hottest, greatest thing that's going to make you secure. And really, like, if you SBOM all the things, and you have log4j everywhere, but you have not patched it a single place, you're just as insecure as the person who doesn't even know they have log4j out there. So
Right.
it's a means to an end for sure. And I do think this is a little bit of a hot take. It reminds me of, we were obsessed as a community with cross-site scripting for, a super long time. And, everyone's found cross-site scripting everywhere. And we created so many, RFCs for how to deal with it. There's been so much discussion about it. And it's not that it's not an impactful vulnerability to a degree, but it's like, again, what actually causes hacks most of the time? Like unpatched software, weak credentials, leak credentials, things like that. But as a
Phishing,
community,
like,
we phishing, yeah, phishing for sure. Um, but we as a community got obsessed, like, let's solve this issue. Let's force people to do stuff like CSP, which I think it's a useful content security policy is a useful tool. But what is more useful, moving like all of your SQL queries to an ORM to make sure that you don't have SQL injection, or implementing CSP to prevent potential cross-site scripting? I don't know. Like, again, SBOM is a means to an end. It is good for you to have in case, you do have the log4j type of thing. You need to know every app that might be relying on it so you can go out and patch it, all that kind of stuff. But it's like, don't become obsessed with that one thing. It's one step on the journey versus, the pot of gold at the end of it. So yeah, I agree. And again, vendors should not drive security culture or security goals.
yeah,
Like, they are tools in your tool set to achieve a certain part of your overall goal. They're not there's no silver bullet until we start our company, and then that's when it's going to be a
yeah,
silver bullet.
that's
Okay.
right. That's right.
So erase this episode after we start our company.
Exactly. The end all be all of security. I
Exactly.
mean,
Yeah.
and I mean, just to tack onto that, like, uh, really, it it's we kind of you said it was nuanced, and I appreciate that you're saying that, because I think the it makes me realize that it's kind of like, it kind of sounds like a lot of BS to a degree, because it's like, on one hand, we have these tools, and if you go too, it really is just like a big it depends answer. And so I think it's like, when you go to when you think about these problems, the most important thing is to just like trust your instincts as a professional and do what you think is best for the organization, because you're going to have all of these folks, all of these people telling you this is the thing that you need to do in order to make your organization secure. And I think all of us at one point in our careers have always like tended to go down the rabbit hole of one issue and solve that issue, and you're like, I am good to go. And I think application security on the whole is the biggest victim in that, because if you look at something like vulnerability management and you're like, yeah, man, we all of our criticals are done, all of our highs are done, we're on to mediums, and then they haven't even touched like application vulnerabilities. And you can pass all your audits with that, and you can showcase all these things, and you can say, yeah, we are like the most secure organization on the planet, and never have scanned an application. And and that is because of that, because the industry pushed vulnerability management onto like the network side, and then people ignored applications for the longest time. So contextualize your risk and then use these as tools. Especially, I mean, I love these tools. I mean, I love being able to see the software bill of materials. I love being able to have that information in our data set to be able to make decisions. But it can't be the only thing you use. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from this, is like, just use all the things at your disposal. Don't focus on one thing. Identify what's going to be the highest impact for you. If you can't do that, that's an issue. Being able to contextualize risk is a big part of the game.
Yeah.
So we are well over our 30 minutes, but I've been having a lot of fun with this conversation. Anything you want to close out with?
Who knew that SBOMs and SCA were so much fun? I
They're
didn't know.
they're the bomb, you know.
No, I mean, I think we said it all. I think we've covered it. We solved that issue, and next episode we'll solve the next issue.
All right,
So
perfect.
we'll just keep keeping on.
Good. Well, look, thank you all for rejoining us on another episode of Related to DevSecOps. Really appreciate you tuning in and listening to us. If you've made it this far, please continue to listen, and we'll see you next time.